Hey everyone, welcome back. This week we're talking about my favorite novel, American War, Omar El-Akkad. I love this novel for our course, for our discussion, simply because it is such a radical departure from all the other works we've looked at so far. Not just because of the story it tells or the way it depicts the kind of America we see in 2074 or 2095, but also in how we see these characters impacted by their environment, impacted by the politics of their day, impacted by the family dynamics that ultimately shapes how Surratt goes about her life, how she's influenced by the people within her circle and the kind of environment she finds herself growing up inside, and also how the tropes of Cli-Fi, as we've come to see them, are used and reimagined and even played with by El-Akkad throughout this novel in ways that I think are a much more radical departure from what we saw in California or Gold Fame Citrus and even Clade. Many of us probably think this novel is a welcome relief from the kind of characterization and plot development we saw in our other novels. Others are probably pretty weirded out by the ending and certainly the kinds of choices that Surratt makes. By the end of the novel, she takes full agency, meaning she does things on her own. She makes these choices. She, like Luz before her, finds a way to end her own life, and yet she takes the world with her. Not exactly an uplifting ending, not exactly full of hope, and yet in her action to save Benjamin, to send him off with these pirates of sort, of these smugglers who take him up to New Anchorage, so he can live, so he can escape and find his own life outside of the death and destruction that Surratt is bringing. That too is a kind of choice of, well, why did she do this? We can ask these questions because ultimately Benjamin doesn't have an answer. And we, as the readers who are hearing this kind of confession, right, as all narratives, all first-person narratives end up being, Benjamin's confession of what he knows of Surratt, of how he is describing her life, what he knows of his grandparents, what he knows of his dead aunt, what he knows of this war, right, ultimately plays into what we as readers are meant to take away from it. I'm going to make a case that Surratt is the most subversive female protagonist that we've read so far. Doesn't mean that she's a good person. Doesn't mean that her actions are justified and righteous. Certainly not. That she becomes a mass murderer, that she becomes the instrument of genocide is highly problematic. What is it we're supposed to feel compelled by in someone who would take those kinds of actions? Certainly, Cli-Fi has been filled not with hopeful endings or hopeful depictions, and yet in Surratt we see someone who is capable of making up her own mind. She is traumatized, she is victimized, she is highly abused, and we see that in such gruesome detail. Those scenes where she was in this prison camp, that futuristic Guantanamo Bay of sorts, those were just sickening scenes. And yet, Surratt comes back and eventually she becomes her own person again. Damaged and murderous, but she finds agency in a way that Luz did not, in a way that Frida did not. Those characters ultimately are overwhelmed by their environments, right? Frida ends up buying into what the Pines is selling and she adopts a whole new personality. Right? Fully aware of the kind of authoritarian Big Brother-esque hold that the Pines has on families who manage to live there. Luz comes to the realization that her whole life has just been kind of wasted, that she is unable to find a place in this terrorized and terrifying Dune Sea world, and so she lets the water take her away. She actively commits her own suicide. Surratt also committing suicide and yet making the choice to take millions of people with her. Her act of revenge, her inability to find her way out of that trauma outside of murdering anyone and anyone who gets in her way. That's an act that also shows off her inner workings. I think Surratt as a character is very complex because of not just her physical actions, but also her inner workings. She is very smart. She is very compassionate in her own way. She feels what others are feeling, even in this really gruesome kind of environment where she grows up, that refugee camp that's split off by statehoods, that's split off by family allegiances, that's split off by how red is your family, how red are you. What she grows up seeing as understanding is this war is not a war that ultimately is very righteous or is ultimately very just. She understands that it is lunacy. When the Blues ultimately storm the camp and commit that atrocity, that great murder of everyone that she knows and cares about, that damage that she takes with her then forward, that sets her on the path to become this instrument of destruction, the sniper, the foot soldier, the ultimate living bomb. Those actions are meant, I think, are meant to make us as readers feel for what turns a human being into this instrument of terror. As you saw in probably the TED video, LI582 spent many years as a journalist, traveling through war-torn areas, visiting refugee camps in Syria, and it's very easy to picture the kind of world that LI582 probably saw firsthand. How martyrs are made, how extremists are made. That in the novel, when the people put on the farmer's suit, right? These bombs where they make these daring runs up to the front line to try and kill as many people as they can. They're usually shot dead meters before they can make any real damage or lasting impact. They know what they're doing. We can kind of understand, or we come to understand, how these kinds of martyrs are made, how someone is turned into an extremist. The relationship between Albert Gaines and Joe and Surratt, you can almost picture what LI582 is doing with that is how, throughout history, how insurgents are made by manipulation from a very young age, how child soldiers are made, lack of options, lack of access, growing up in a situation where there's just no hope, where you're living hour to hour, if at best day to day. You can see how many people grow up in that and see, my life is not worth anything unless I can cause destruction, unless I can take people down with me. And in Surratt, we see the emotional impact, we see that logic taking shape. Not happy, not positive, but still the development there makes her more than just a lunatic murderer, makes her more than just the kind of flat characters or flat representations that we might imagine, just from our other readings or from pop culture. I think Surratt as a character in this in her being so subversive and so in depth of her development lends itself to then how are you meant to feel by the end of the novel. It's ambiguous at best. By the end of the novel, some 50 years have passed as Benjamin relates to us. And how are we understanding what's being transmitted to us? What kind of how are we meant to understand the story that's being told? How are we supposed to walk away feeling of it? These are all angles of the story that I think are just ripe for analysis. And my hope is that you guys are comfortable with digging into it. Certainly, this novel is as dark as anything we've read, and yet I think that darkness, that sense of political catastrophe, isn't necessarily dystopian. I'm gonna open up a can of worms here. Just because it's horrifying, just because it's terrifying, just because it ultimately leads to massive destruction and death, doesn't necessarily mean that it is of the dystopian genre the same way that Gold-Famed Citrus or California are. Why I say that is I don't think any character in this book imagines that the hands above them, the puppet masters pulling the strings, these refugee camps, this war, this North and South, Red and Blues division is worth it, right? Even by the end, the last few remaining holdouts who are of the Red rebellion, even they know that their cause is an ultimate lost cause. And I say this, that's part of what I think in our real world now we see is the wars that are fought, these battles, these skirmishes, these divisions. are not leading to anything except more misery, more death, more pain, more divisions that take forever to last. Looking forward to our conversation. I'm just about out of time. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say and what you think of this novel. Get to it.